Let's move on and talk about politics more generally. Joining me now is Michael Mosbacher, who's Associate Editor at The Telegraph. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'll let my blood pressure settle.
Indeed, exactly. Extraordinary headlines, you're right.
It really is extraordinary. I mean, in this particular section, I like to talk generally about who's had a good week, who's had a bad week, also who should have a week off, who we should keep an eye on. Just from your background, how do you view the state of British politics? We've got a government that is clearly rudderless, tensions between various factions within the party, the rise of Reform UK, now ahead of the Tories in 7 polls. Just your overview of where we are, really, politically.
Yeah, who'd have thought we'd be here last July? Labour wins its landslide win, biggest majority for however long it is, worst Tory results since the party's founded in 1830s, and now we're here. There are obviously signs. The Labour majority was huge in number of seats, but not in percentage of the votes. And now politics is completely fractured. Roughly, the polls are all showing Tories, Labour, Reform pretty much level pegging, all around a quarter of the votes. If you had an election now, you'd clearly have a hung parliament. Just because of how the arithmetic works, it's likely that Labour would still be the largest party, so you'd end up with a Labour, Lib Dem, whatever coalition if the election had been now. But a hopeless state of play. The Tories aren't managing to cut through, Reform's riding further, and we've got an incredibly unpopular government.
Incredibly unpopular. And you're reading really just, I'm sorry, I'm digressing slightly, but Kemi Badenoch, she was sort of heralded as the new arrival of the Conservative Party. I liked a lot of what she had to say, but she doesn't seem to have any policy. She hasn't delivered, and I know that there is huge infighting in CCHQ over what is going on, and apparently the money has just simply dried up in terms of funding and donations to the Conservative Party.
Yeah, the lack of policy is part of the deliberate strategy, mad as it sounds.
Is it?
Thinking that you've got the Rachel Reeves idea, Kemi Badenoch's idea is you need to have the right mood music, the right sort of sounds, the right sort of I'm on your side, pro-free speech, that sort of thing. And then the policies come later. But it clearly hasn't worked so far. I mean, she's just not cutting through. But I mean, that's, I think, what the idea is. They've sort of looked at historical examples where policies took a while to come out with. But I mean, it's clearly not working. But I mean, that's the idea behind it. And you're right on the funding side of things. Reform seems to be. We haven't had the latest figures through yet, but Reform seems to be doing all the running, and the Tories. It'll get worse and worse for the Tories so long as people don't think they're in the running to be the next government.
It's fascinating. It really is fascinating. I've got friends of mine in the Conservative Party who believe they have a divine right to rule, which clearly isn't right. Let's go back onto track. So who's had a good week this week politically?
I'd argue Rachel Reeves has had a good week. Might sound odd. She's had a dreadful 6 months.
Right.
Tax rises, all of that. Shocking 6 months. Why she's had a good week is this week she said her speech on growth of Heathrow, and that suggests that she's finally accepting that the agenda, the growth agenda, is incompatible with both net zero and the policy she's pushed through. So she's beginning to realise something's got to change. We've got to start grappling the issues. What I've done on national insurance increases, non-dom status, VAT on school fees, all the rest of it isn't going to work. Whether she'll revert, obviously that's not the way she'd put it. She'd claim the two can somehow be made compatible, but it's looking like she's sort of somewhat reconsidering the policies over the last 6 months.
I mean, there's a great story in the Telegraph this morning, which you've probably seen, the budget for growth, which she delivered, this sort of triumphant budget for growth. It was followed by the largest spike in businesses closing down since lockdown. 4,500 companies shut from October to December. That's, I mean, it's shambolic.
She's had, as I was saying, she's had a disastrous 6 months. Total shambles. The budget for growth increase employer national insurance contributions, about the worst tax increase you can have for growth, reducing employment, reducing new recruitment, etc. But the only reason she's had a good week is that she seems that speech this week and then the Heathrow announcement and the planning announcement seem to suggest that they're beginning to realise this can't go on. Something needs to change. They will actually change it.
I mean, the thing is,
Pressure is rather more doubtful.
These are reheated policies, aren't they? I mean, I think the number of times I've been talking about Heathrow and the third runway, and then you've got people like noises off, like Sadiq Khan, who can't keep control of knife crime in the capital. But Sadiq Khan saying he's going to fight his own government.
Exactly. And I mean, these projects all take forever in the UK, don't they? I mean, we've been debating Heathrow expansion for 40 years and it hasn't been happening. So so whether she achieves anything it's doubtful, and it won't happen anytime soon. But she seems to. There was also the announcement on the non-dom stuff being watered down slightly. She's only tinkering around the edges. But with sort of more millionaires leaving Britain, 10,000 millionaires leaving Britain last year, and the biggest exodus of millionaires after China in the world, she's beginning to realise that something must be changed. There seems to be some realisation that the current plan isn't working. Whether they'll succeed in changing is much more doubtful. It's likely to be very small tinkering around the edges, but the realisation suggests there's potentially hope if she actually grapples and does those changes.
You know, I think if she was manned up or personed up or womaned up and said, look, the VAT on private schools was a terrible mistake, the employer national insurance contribution is a terrible mistake, and we are actually going to get rid of those, I actually think people would have respect for her.
That's true. But she won't be doing that. It'll be tinkering around the edges. It'll be sort of a reduction there, not a reduction, a sort of an opt-out there, that sort of thing, rather than a wholesale change.
OK, who has had a bad week? And there's a lot to choose from.
Rory Stewart has had a shocking week. His sort of encounter with the American Vice President, J.D. Vance, has certainly knocked a bit of his smugness off. I mean, presents himself as this incredibly wise political leader. And then as Vance's response to him was, Rory Stewart's a man who's got an IQ of 110 and thinks he's got an IQ of 130. Somewhat punctured his sort of pretense of omniscience.
It's funny, isn't it? Because it's funny because Rory Stewart was kind of heralded originally as this kind of, as you say, a sage, a wise man who kind of understood where the British public stood and the way that British public thought, but he has become increasingly erratic.
Exactly, precisely. You're correct. It's bizarre to think that so recently he stood for the Tory leadership and wasn't written off at all. I mean, when Liz Truss eventually won, he was one of the candidates for the Tory leadership. I mean, he's been quite a prominent figure, was seen as the hope. His sageness is partly to the way he's been presented, is partly to do with how he's written up his own past and his travels around Iraq and Afghanistan, and his sort of colonial role there, quasi-colonial role there, throwback to an earlier age, fits into a certain English stereotype. But clearly... exactly, his sageness is also noticeable with the US election. He sort of pronounced a few days before the election, he'd worked it all out, it was certain there'd be a big Kamala Harris win, and that didn't exactly turn out to be right.
Oops. Now, I mentioned this earlier. Who should we keep an eye on? And you've chosen for your choice something that I also flagged this morning. Tell us more.
Yeah, Friedrich Merz. There's an election coming up in Germany this month, later this month. And Merz is the leader of the Christian Democrats. This was Angela Merkel's old party, the sort of centre-right party. But what's happened is he's basically going against the former leader, going against Merkel, saying mass immigration, her letting in 1 million migrants during the height of the Syrian crisis has been a disaster. Germany needs to get tough on immigration. What's happened there is Germany's got a proportional representation electoral system, and it's difficult for them to win an election outright. And it's particularly difficult because what's happened is the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, which is a sort of right-wing populist party, has been rising on an anti-immigration platform. And in Germany, there's this big taboo of the mainstream parties, Conservative, Labour equivalent, CDU, Social Democrats, cooperating with a so-called far-right party. And I mean, the taboo is understandable. It's historical reasons. It's that Hitler only came to power in 1933 with support of the mainstream right, mainstream conservatives. And so there's been a massive taboo of having anything to do with them. And Merz still says, I won't govern with right-wing populists. But this week, he pushed through a vote in the German parliament, the German Bundestag, with the support of AfD MPs. And that on its own, even though it was the Christian Democrat motion, was seen as hugely controversial. But from a British point of view, so the wider watch is... will Germany move on immigration? If Germany starts having much tougher policies on immigration, Britain's very much the odd man out. Germany was the country which was probably the most liberal on immigration, and lots of Europe's problems caused by Angela Merkel's, at the time seen as hugely bold decision. She declared the Wirtschaftnis of we can do it. We can allow all these million immigrants in and it won't impact German society. Well, it's been proven wrong. They can't do it. I mean, there's been all sorts of crime spikes, all sorts of problems in Germany, and it's caused precisely what Merkel was trying to avoid. It's caused a rise of, if you want to call it, far-right party, which is on 25% of the votes. You have various far-left parties in Germany on between 5 and 8% of the votes. So a third of the electorate is voting for parties which are outside the mainstream. And that's partly a result of Merkel's disastrous policy back in 2016.
It really is. I mean, it really is extraordinary. And finally, if I may, who do you think should have a week off?
Tony Blair. He's pronounced Tony Blair keeps having an input on politics, and he's come up with a wheeze for how to stop populism growing.
Oh, yeah.
And his wheeze, we need to introduce ID cards and have more surveillance and use AI for greater surveillance. The logic being this is the way you can crack down on immigration. But if you've already got huge distrust in the political class, huge distrust in government decisions, the answer isn't exactly saying, I'll tell you what we need. We need more surveillance, more ID, more state control. Completely mad idea.
But also, the thing about Tony Blair is the answer is always things like ID cards. It always comes back to ID cards. It doesn't matter what question you ask him. The answer is always ID cards, as far as I can see.
Precisely. Everything can be solved with ID cards. And then, on top of that, the idea of Blair having any solutions to migration when it shot up during his time in power is ludicrous. He's hardly the person to lecture on those issues.
Very good, Michael. Really good to talk to you. Thank you ever so much for your time. That's Michael Mosbacher, who's Associate Editor at The Telegraph.